this video, I want to talk about some of the influences on English vocabulary in the Middle English period, especially in terms of borrowing. Where are they getting new words from? So we saw in the Old English period that they were borrowing from both Old Norse and from Latin, although not in huge numbers, maybe a few hundred of each. In the Middle English period, there are a lot more words coming in, but really only from one main source. So some of the languages that maybe you would expect borrowings to happen from are no longer really active in that regard. So the Celtic languages, which were the native languages of the people of England, they have no impact. And in fact, the Celtic languages are not spoken in England itself anymore. They're spoken in neighbors like Wales to the west and Scotland to the north and then Ireland, but not in England proper. Old English or English itself has just won out. So there's no real Celtic influence. Old Norse, we know that in the earlier period that the Danelaw was established and Old Norse speakers had begun to live in England, and they had had some impact on the vocabulary of Old English. By this point, all those Old Norse speakers are speaking English, right? Old Norse has died out in England, and so there's not going to be a huge influx of words from Old Norse either. Latin was another big contender for an impact on the vocabulary of Old English, and we saw that was mainly through the context of the church. As the speakers of Old English adopted Christianity, they had to borrow words to describe new concepts, and they borrowed them from Latin, which is the language of the Christian church. But by this point, they had pretty much gotten all the words they needed to describe Christianity, so they don't have to borrow a lot of new words from Latin itself. So where are they getting their new words from? Because they are getting many words, right? Like thousands at this point instead of hundreds. They're getting them from French, right? Largely Norman French. So Norman French becomes the largest source of borrowed words in this period. Now, we know that Norman French is a dialect of French, which means that it's ultimately comes from Vulgar Latin, right? Its parent language is Vulgar Latin. And so this means that the vast majority of words in Norman French come from Latin. Not all of them, there are some other influences in there, but the majority of words in French, and therefore Norman French, come from Latin itself. So English is going to borrow words from Norman French, and those words have their roots ultimately in Latin. So before we look a little bit at how that process works, I want to talk about what happens to Latin words when they get to French. Because there are changes, right? Over time, language changes in different ways, and different languages have different patterns for how they deal with consonants and vowel sounds and things like that. We've seen this with like how Proto-Indo-European changes when it goes to Greek versus Latin versus English, right? And so I want to take a look at some of the ways that Latin changes, some of the patterns in the way that Latin changes when it gets to French. Because by studying these, you can have a better sense of roots, Latin roots in English words, even when they have already changed a bit by going through French. So let's look at this Latin to French process. So this is not going to be a complete list of the major patterns of how Latin words change when they enter French. This is going to be some of the big ones. But this includes deletion. So Latin words, when they get to French, often lose parts of themselves. And I will say the first syllable tends to be preserved, and the stressed syllable, the one you put the stress on when you pronounce it, which tends to be the second to last. They tend to be preserved. You keep those. Other syllables, though, can drop. The last syllable, which is generally the inflectional ending, drops. Middle syllables can drop, anything in between there. So, for instance, Latin has a word, periculosum. Per, right, at the beginning is its first syllable. This lo here, this los here, is the stressed syllable. The rest doesn't matter so much, right? This is the ending, for instance, the Periculosum in Latin becomes in Old French perilos, which becomes in English peril. And so periculosum, pericula there means danger, right? And then perilous means danger, and peril means danger. And so this derives ultimately from here, which can be difficult to tell unless you know that, oh, well, there could be extra consonants or syllables that have dropped out here. So deletion often happens. Another thing that happens, this is a heck of a word, diphthongization. if you guys aren't familiar with the concept of a diphthong, it is two vowels next to each other that are pronounced like one vowel. Like in the word beat, EA is pronounced as one vowel, it's pronounced as a long E, even though it's written as two vowels. So this is a process that tends to happen where when Latin had a simple vowel, like a single vowel, it becomes a diphthong in French. So for instance, the Latin word sanctum, the gets dropped out, right, because of deletion, and actually the k sound in the middle gets dropped out as well. You're sort of left with sant, but this simple vowel, this A, becomes a diphthong. It becomes saint, right? And so it develops into a diphthong here. So your saint ultimately comes from sanctum, the sacred thing, right, in Latin. Along with these two processes, we also have a general set of consonant shifts. Again, just like we saw happen from Proto-Indo-European to English or Proto-Indo-European to Latin or Greek, there are a set of pretty common consonant shifts that happen to Latin words when they enter French. So sometimes it affects the initial letter, the initial consonant of a word. So when you see a C at the beginning of a word in Latin, in French it can turn to a CH. So Latin cantus becomes French chant, right? Chant comes from cantus, the sense of singing, right, or intoning. When there's a G at the beginning of a word in Latin, in French it often turns to a J, right? So the Latin word gaudium becomes the French word joie, J-O-I-E, which is modern English joy. So the G becomes the J, the D dropped out, it's a deletion here. All right, a D at the beginning of a Latin word can become a J in French. So the Latin word diurnalum, right, becomes in French journal, right, which is English journal, right? Comes from this word diurnalum. It means daily, right, because it's what you write in daily or keep records in daily. So that's some initial letters. Next up, the medial letters. So these are consonants that appear somewhere in the middle of a word. So a D in the middle of the word in Latin can become a G, or sometimes spelled J, D-G, sound in a French word. So for instance, the Latin word judicem becomes the Old French word juge, which is English judge, right? So this D becomes a J sound, softens. A G in the middle of a Latin word can become an I or a Y in French. So the Latin word legalum becomes in French the word loyal, spelled with an I, English loyal, which we spell with a Y. And then two other ones that are fairly common. The consonant cluster, right, the consonant combination MB in Latin, when those Latin words hit French, they tend to shift to NG. So, for instance, you have cambiat in Latin, which is a verb. It means like it occurs or something similar to that. This becomes change in French, right? So that initial C becomes a ch sound, the MB becomes an NG, cambiat becomes change. And when you have a vowel followed by CT in Latin, it tends to become a vowel followed by just a T in French. So we saw sanctum becomes saint, where the C kind of drops out. Perhaps a better example is fructum in Latin, which becomes in French fruit, right? The C drops out, and then we have the diphthongization, U becomes UI. Okay, so these are just some of the big ones. And again, just being familiar with these can help you to trace an English word that has comes from a Latin root and sort of trace any changes that may have occurred to it during its French phase. All right, so English is bringing in lots of words from Norman French. These words tend to be related to the government, to the army, to the law courts, the kind of spheres where Norman French is used very regularly, as well as words that refer to sort of elite or aristocratic things or interests, because, again, that's where the language is being used and that's where it's being picked up from. I do, though, want to talk about an idea of doublets. Right. We kind of touched on this idea before, but I didn't give it a name. So when a Norman French word enters English, sometimes it is a completely new word, right? It's not related to anything that the English already know about. It's a new concept. It's a new idea. It's just something new. Sometimes the Norman French word replaces the Old English word. We saw this with Old Norse as well. Sometimes there was a word that was used in English, and the Old Norse word just got used instead. It was preferred. Like egg, right? Old Norse egg for earlier Old English ea. So sometimes it's just a replacement. But sometimes both are used. Right? Essentially, both the English and the Norman French word for the same exact concept are used, but with a different sense. And again, we saw this with Old Norse, where sometimes there's an English word and the Old Norse word gets introduced. They're meant to refer to the same exact thing, and they both are preserved in the language, but with slightly different senses, like skirt versus shirt or hole versus hail. And these are called doublets, when you have this kind of doubling of a word. With Norman French, we do see these doublets sometimes, and I would say there's a general distinction between the way that the English word is used and the French word is used, and that is that the French word tends to be a bit more technical or a bit more impersonal. The English word tends to be a bit more sort of everyday colloquial. So I'm going to give you some examples to give you a better sense of what I mean. So the English speakers had a word doom. The French speakers introduced their word for the same idea, judgment. Judgment's a little bit more clinical. Doom there's more of a feel to doom. It's not a good feeling, but there's more of a feel to doom. Mansion versus house, right? This is the English word for the concept. This is the Norman French word for the concept. But house feels very colloquial, very everyday. Mansion feels a little bit more formal, right? Just one more example, cordial versus hearty. Cordial is our French one. Hearty is our English one. Hearty, there's something a little bit more familiar or colloquial about it. Cordial feels a little bit more formal, right? So there's this general distinction in how we use the English words themselves and then the ones that we borrowed from French. There is a second type of doublet that we can talk about in terms of these new French words, and that is that sometimes we borrow a word from Norman French, and then English speakers borrowed the exact same word from Standard French. So remember, Norman French is just a dialect of French, and it's like a low dialect because it's being spoken by a bunch of ex-Vikings. And so they have their own weird way of pronouncing things. That's not the way that most French people at the time are speaking it. So sometimes the English speakers take a word from Norman French, because that's what they're in contact with, and then later they borrow the same exact word from Standard French, but it's pronounced or spelled differently because the two dialects of French are so different. And so we get these doublets as well. So, for instance, we borrowed castle from Norman French, but from Standard French, we borrowed the exact same word, except in Standard French, it was pronounced chateau. We borrowed hostel from Norman French, then we borrowed the same word from Standard French, where it was pronounced hotel. Pocket, we got from Norman French, then we took it out of Standard French, where it is pronounced pouch. Warden, we got from Norman French, then we took it out of Standard French, where they pronounced it guardian, because apparently the g sound of Standard French became wa in Norman French. And while, right, like wily or wiles, we got from Norman French, and then we borrowed it from Standard French, where it's pronounced a guile. So we do sometimes see these doublets where we borrowed the same word from Norman and then Standard French, but they look different because they have different pronunciations in those two dialects of French. Okay, so over the course of the Middle English period, English borrows thousands and thousands of words from French, and this is a huge infusion of new vocabulary into the English language, although overall the English vocabulary is still pretty small. It's really going to explode in the next period, in the modern period. Okay, so that's it for the vocabulary of the Middle English period. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.